Don't be misled by your data. Don't correlate proportions. And that includes percentages, parts per million, or any other data that carry only relative information. The correlation between two sets of values is a very popular measure of association. You probably already know that correlation between two sets of measurements doesn't imply that one causes the other. And you also probably know that the correlation between two sets of measurements doesn't tell us the shape of the relationship between the measurements. Here we're going to give another caution about correlation by showing that it is not an appropriate measure of association for percentages, proportions, parts per million, or any values that carry only relative information. But why should you care? Well, you should care if you don't want to be misled by numbers, your numbers or someone else's. There are lots of scientific measurements, as well as economic, business and social data that carry only relative information. Percentages are a common example. We're particularly interested in bioscience data that carry only relative information. This includes gene, protein and metabolite expression at the cellular level, all the way through to biodiversity and species abundance at the ecosystem level. However, to ensure that this video makes sense to a wide audience, we're going to use an example based on books and bookshops. And since we can only readily visualize data in 3 dimensions, we will look at 3 categories of books: cookbooks, thrillers, and all others. Our interest focuses on cookbooks and thrillers and the relationship between their sales in 4 different bookshops. Let's plot the percentages of cookbooks and thrillers sold at the bookshops. Well, looks like there's a strong relationship between cookbooks and thrillers, doesn't it? Looks like the more cookbooks you sell, the fewer thrillers are bought. It's tempting to think up a story to explain this, like thrill seekers less interested in food or cooks like the quiet life. And it's exactly this temptation we want to warn you about, because on their own, these percentages tell us nothing about any relationship between the numbers of thrillers and cookbooks sold. We'll show this by moving into the 3rd dimension. The trio of percentages at each bookshop lies on a special triangular plane in 3D called a simplex. Anywhere on the simplex, the 3 values add up to 100%. That is the defining feature of a simplex, the natural space for relative information. All points on a simplex add up to a constant. But what about the actual numbers of books? Where are they in these 3 dimensions? Any point on a simplex corresponds to actual numbers lying somewhere on the ray from the origin through that point. For example, suppose a store reports that its sales were 40% cookbooks, 40% thrillers, and of course 20% everything else. The store could have sold 400 cookbooks, 400 thrillers, and 200 others, or 8,000, 8,000 and 4,000 of each. All these and infinitely many more lie on this ray and could give rise to these percentages. So what were the actual sales of thrillers, cookbooks and others in these 4 stores? We can't say from the percentages alone, and this also means we can't say what the relationship between actual sales of these kinds of books might be across different stores. We'll show you what we mean. Here are some sales figures, actual numbers of books sold that could have happened across the 4 stores. Just like the percentages of cookbooks and thrillers, the actual numbers sold are perfectly negatively correlated, lying on a nice straight line in exactly the way that real data never does. But here are some more sales figures that could have happened. Hang on, what's this? These show actual sales of cookbooks and thrillers are perfectly positively correlated. And here's a final set of sales figures, all of which could have given us the percentages we saw, but very different from the 2 sets of sales figures that lay on the nice straight lines. The key message is that the perfectly correlated percentages we started with tell us nothing about the relationship between the actual numbers of cookbooks and thrillers sold across the 4 stores. So what? Well, the take-home message is that correlation is not an appropriate measure of association for percentages, proportions, or parts per million, indeed any data that carry only relative information. It just doesn't tell us what's going on with the actual amounts that gave rise to the percentages. So if correlation is not okay for data that carry only relative information, what is a suitable measure of association? It turns out to be proportionality. If a set of percentages are proportional, then the actual amounts that gave rise to them have to be proportional too. Let's go back to our 3D video to see what this looks like geometrically. This time we start with 4 pairs of percentages whose ratios are the same, that is, they have the same constant of proportionality, 3:2. Again we ask, what does this say about the relationship between the actual sales of cookbooks and thrillers? And again, these numbers must lie on the rays from the origin through the points on the simplex. Here's one possible scenario. Here's another, and here's a third. You can see in this final shot that the ratio of actual numbers of thrillers and cookbooks sold is the same as the ratio of the percentages of thrillers and cookbooks, that is 3:2. So, if you have 2 relative amounts that always appear in proportion, then their corresponding actual amounts must also be proportional. So, don't use correlation as a measure of association for relative amounts. Use proportionality instead.